Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm really glad that we had Greg here, who actually did the proper invitation and proper introduction. My name is Ivana Karasova. I'm the research fellow with the Association for International Affairs, where I focus on China's energy security, security as such, politics and foreign policy, economy, basically everything covering China. Since Greg already said everything about David, I'm not going to introduce him once again. I will just say a few words about his book, which is, the title is behind me, it's China Going Global, the Partial Power. In his text, David argues that China is, though is growing militarily, economically, politically, it is a power, but it's not a global power, it's what he calls partial power. He says that China still didn't exchange the power for the influence, the ability to influence the outcomes of international relations. He argues that China is a global actor without being a global power. China is rather a partial power. And unlike alarmists in the United States and also here in Europe, he says that he's quite skeptical about China's rise and sees China more as a passive actor who only gradually has become a selective activist. I will stop here and give you Professor Shambaugh. We will have about 45 minutes, 50 minutes of his presentation, and then we shall have a discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thanks for coming. Can you hear me in the back room? It's okay? Sorry you have to be stranded back there, but try and speak up. Well, thanks again for the invitation and to the U.S. Embassy, public diplomacy, for investing American taxpayer dollars and getting Americans abroad to speak. I'm happy to do that. I believe very much in public diplomacy, and I'm really pleased to be back in Prague. It's been 4 or 5 years, I think, since I was last here speaking at Charles University as a guest of my colleague in the front row. So I'm really pleased to be here again. This time I'm going to, as you know, be speaking about this new book of mine. It's just literally come out. It exists. After 5 years, 6 years of work, research in various parts of the world and in China itself, finally just appeared last week in the United States. But it's available on Amazon, so you can order it, from Amazon, and it'll be hopefully, it's published by Oxford University Press, so hopefully it'll be available here in Europe before too long.
Sure, there's a Kindle edition. I just downloaded it. So there's a Kindle edition.
Oh yeah, there's a Kindle edition. Yep, you probably did it on audio. Soon to be a major motion picture. Doubt that. Anyway, I'm really pleased to have a chance to discuss it. Literally, it's hot off the presses, so let me try and introduce to you what the book's about and what the arguments I make in it are. Clearly, China, by many measures is a significant power. It's, many think, perhaps the world's second leading power today after the United States. Its aggregate economy now ranks number 2, and depending on the estimates that you read, is due to surpass the aggregate American economy sometime between 2020 and 2025. And we're all aware over the last 2 decades of the really dramatic transformation that China has made, moving from the periphery to the center of international relations. We read about China every day in our media. It is gaining increasing global attention. Whenever you pick up a newspaper or magazine or turn on television, you find China scouring the globe for resources, soaking up investment. It's been the world's, I think, leading or second leading recipient of foreign direct investment for most of the last 2 three decades actually, it's beginning to expand its own international investment. That's one of the new stories. And it has been rather more assertive, we say. That's a term that seems to have found its way into the news and international relations vocabulary, more assertive in its Asian neighborhood, particularly after 2009, but even recently, in the case of the East China Sea disputes with Japan. Actually, I was just in Japan last week, where that is dominating attention, I should say. China's become the sought-after nation, sought-after suitor in global governance diplomacy. China's been modernizing its military very steadily and literally sailing its navy into new waters on different parts of the planet. China's been broadening its global media exposure and presence around the world and doing other things that I'll describe tonight in an attempt to build its own soft power and improve its international image. And China's economy has continued to grow at significant rates, even though somewhat reduced from the previous 2 decades. It's now down to 7 to 8%, around 8%. So in these ways, China's global impact is increasingly being felt on every continent, in most international institutions, and on many global issues. But the story of China's rise, I would submit, is not a new one. We've been following this for a couple of decades in the field of international relations. The media has too. Scholars have been writing a great deal about the rise of China. Actually, I was in my office a couple of days ago and I counted on the shelf my own collection, more than 20 books that have the word rise in the title. About 20 books about China have the word rise in the title. And this has resulted in a variety of studies over the last few years, some with pretty fanciful titles. You've probably seen or read or heard of a book that appeared 2 years ago by Martin Jacques, a British scholar, entitled "When China Rules the World, the Rise of the Middle Kingdom and the End of the Western World." That's a fairly shocking title, but it's managed to sell him quite a number of copies around the world. I hope my book can do even half as well as his has done. His has been translated into 15 languages, he told me, and has sold several 100,000 copies. That's not bad for an author. So you have to have, I guess, if you're an author, rule number one is have a catchy, scary title. But my title is not so scary or catchy. Then we have other books, such as James King's China Shakes the World, The Rise of a Hungry Nation, and others have used even more sensationalist titles. I came across one the other day called Death by China. And there's another one that's quite widely read in the United States called Eclipse, Living in the Shadow of China's Dominance. So there's no shortage. One way or another, much of this writing about China's rise raises the specter of a rather dramatic transformation in Asian and world affairs as a result of China's impact. And in the United States, I can tell you, much of this writing about China juxtaposes China's rise in the context of America's global position, and argues that, and sort of views China's rise very ethnocentrically, I would argue, through an American prism. What does it mean for American interests? What does it mean for American position? I don't think that this is necessarily correct. I think we should take a much broader view of China's rise. But Americans are rather ethnocentric people, so we tend to view everything through that prism. So there have been books, many books of that character. What does China's rise mean for the U.S.? What's it mean for U.S.-China relations? One of the most notable ones to be published came out last year by Princeton University professor Aaron Friedberg. A good book I commend to you called The Contest for Supremacy, China, America, and the Struggle for the Mastery of Asia. sort of tells you right there in the title how many American strategists and international relations scholars tend to think about the issue with zero-sum terms, rising power, established power, and what's it going to mean for the Asia-Pacific region and for the world, for that matter. So there's no shortage of studies about China's rise, and most of them predict a kind of discomforting impact on world affairs. So 6 years ago, when I started off on this project, after having worked on a book about internal China, my last book was on China's Communist Party, I decided to take a crack at this question of China's rise, but I wasn't so much interested, I wanted to approach it a little differently. I wasn't so much interested in China's rise as what you might call its spread, kind of horizontally rather than vertically. I wanted to kind of get a grasp on what the sort of presence and activities of China are around the world, quite literally, on a whole series of indicators. Much of the literature, again in the United States, about China's rise focuses on the strategic, military, and diplomatic domain. I wanted to get a much more variegated and comprehensive sense of what China is doing in various continents, various parts of the planet, and get as close as I could really to the totality of China's going global. So I didn't really want to write a book only about Chinese foreign policy or Chinese strategy. I wanted, in my own thinking, I distinguish between foreign policy and foreign relations. Maybe these terms are used interchangeably a lot in the literature, but in my mind they're different. Foreign policy is something that governments do, and governments articulate. Our policy is X. Foreign relations is much more at the societal level, interactions between societies in the world. And it's that I really wanted to get at, not government pronouncements and policies, but really the totality of China's societies, external interactions. So this is what I wanted to capture, but necessarily it's very large and I found extraordinarily complicated subject. This was not an easy book to research, I can tell you, but gratifying in many ways. It took me intellectually in many new directions that I hadn't worked on before, some of which I'm very interested in and will continue to work on. So when I started out, I assumed that China was having a big impact on world affairs, and that my job was sort of simply to explore and elaborate the dimensions of that. You might call it a kind of hypothesis in search of data. I was under the impression that China was all over the planet doing all kinds of things. And it just was really the question of establishing what it was doing and how it was exerting its influence in the world. But surprisingly, and to give you a kind of sneak preview of the conclusions of the book, and the subtitle, well, the subtitle of the book indicates the argument of the book. I call China the partial power. And I found, surprisingly, that, with some exceptions, it's very hard to make statements about China, sort of absolutist statements about any aspect of China. You can't do that because for every statement you make about China, the opposite also happens to be true. It's a highly complex country, domestically and externally. So you can't just say China's a power or not a power. It depends in different dimensions. So, but I look across a whole number of dimensions in this study and find or conclude that China's global power is actually surprisingly limited, much more limited than I had assumed. I find that China's global presence is rather broad, but not particularly deep. To put another way, China has a growing international presence, but it's not really influential. I argue that China is a global actor without yet being a global power. Now you may wonder, what's the difference? Well, the distinction is that true powers influence events, in my view. Merely having presence, global presence, does not equal having global power, unless a nation actually influences events or a particular nation or realm in a particular way. So shaping the desired outcome of a situation is the essence of influence and the exercise of power. And in this regard, I follow the definition, this is a traditional definition, I might say, in international relations literature, at least in the realist tradition. It goes back to Hans Morgenthau and many others, but more recently, in the excellent book by Harvard professor Joseph Nye, entitled The Future of Power, which was published 2 years ago, I think, and is well worth reading. Excellent book. In that book, Nye argues that by themselves, resources do not constitute power unless they are converted and used to influence the outcome of a situation. So you have to actually, this is Nye's argument, so wealth doesn't equal power. Simply by having money doesn't mean you're powerful. And having a series of resources doesn't equal power unless you convert it into trying to influence the outcome, another actor, or the outcome of a situation. So the essence of power lies, again, in the conversion of resources into influence, which is the exercise of power. That's the argument of the book. At least that's the definition I take when I look at China's different dimensions and activities around the world. So that's the core argument to tease you with. Now, I'll come back, I'll try and elaborate it, and then come back to it at the end. The book itself is divided functionally. At first, I considered organizing it geographically. You know, China's relations with Europe, China's relations with Latin America, China's relations with Africa. But I decided that was not really the best way to get at China's global impact. So I organized the book functionally. And there are 5 broad areas, each of which there's a separate chapter on. China's global diplomacy, China's contributions to global governance, China's global economic presence, China's global cultural presence, and China's global military security, or global security presence, of which military is one aspect. And then there's an initial chapter before those 5 case studies that looks at China's domestic debates inside of China about its global roles and responsibilities. So let me start with that, because I think it's very important in international relations studies to understand the mindset of any country. You have to understand perceptions, I believe, are the most important variable in international relations. You have to understand how people think and view situations before you can anticipate how they might act. And throughout my own career and writings, I've always concentrated on that. You'll notice I've written a lot about perceptions. So I thought it was very important to try and get a grip or get a sense of what are the Chinese themselves thinking and saying about their own global role. And I did the research on that primarily during a year in China, 2009, 2010, where I was a visiting scholar at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Institute of World Economics and Politics, on an American Fulbright Award, so beneficiary of American public diplomacy again. And I spent a lot of time during that year interviewing and reading publications of Chinese, not just scholars and academics in the field of international relations, but journalists and bloggers and a variety of media. And I found 2 things in this discourse. First is that there is a very animated and contentious discourse ongoing in China. It still is ongoing. It's not settled yet. About China's global roles and position, and what China's priority should be in the world. The second finding I found is the Chinese are having something of an identity crisis about their role in the world, and where they think their government should place their foreign policy priorities. So in this chapter, I identify no fewer than 7 different schools of thought about China's global roles, what I call their international identities. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to really walk you through all 7 of them. It would take a long time to do that, but you can hopefully read that. It's a spectrum from left to right, what I call the nativists, to the realists, the major power school, Asia First school, Global South school, selective multilateralists, and globalists. Each of those terms indicates where that group of writers and individuals think China should place its priority. So, for example, the nativists think that the priority should be placed at home. China shouldn't be doing anything out there in the world. These are xenophobic nationalists. They've never been comfortable with China's open door policy for the last 30 years to begin with. They think that it's been bad news for China on a number of fronts. It's contaminated China with all kinds of foreign culture, foreign ideologies, foreign money, corrosive things, you know, and it has contaminated Chinese socialism. Well, not surprisingly, a number of these nativists are Marxists. Yes, there are still a lot of Marxists in China, and I remind you this is a country still ruled by a party that calls itself communist, and it takes Marxism-Leninism seriously. So the nativists are at one end of the spectrum, and they're not comfortable that China's going global. And they argue that China should really concentrate at home. And then you kind of work your way through the other schools. Here, taking more time to elaborate this than I wanted to, but the realists are what I call the China firsters. These are hard, just like realists anywhere. They see the international environment as very unpredictable, rather anarchical, and predatory. So the world's a dangerous place. If you're going to go out there in the world, you better be strong. And so the realists argue for China strengthening itself, being actively engaged, and using influence and leverage where China can to advance its own national interests. Okay, so this is very national interest, what I call the China firsters. China first, China second, China third, China fourth. They don't really care at all about other countries and global issues. They do care, though, about strengthening China and asserting a more assertive foreign policy to achieve national ends. The major powers school briefly argues that the major powers, the United States, Russia, and the European Union, if you can think of the European Union as a power, and frankly, the Chinese are not at all certain that you can think of the European Union as a power. They're rather disappointed with the European Union, I would argue. They certainly were before the Lisbon Treaty, but they've become even more so after the Lisbon Treaty. But they nonetheless, you know, if you look at the attributes of the EU, you add them together aggregately, the EU is a power. So the question for this group of school, this school says China's got to place its priority on managing relations with the major powers, of those three, successfully, because those major powers control global finance, they control China's trade, they control investment into China, they control a lot of stuff that is important to China. So if your relations with those three powers are not good, China's interests are damaged. And amongst those three powers, the United States is what they call the zhong zhong zhu zhong, the key of the keys. You've got to have relations with Washington, right? Or it will impinge on China's national interests. So that's that school. The Asia First school, as you might assume, says no, it's not the major powers that are the priority to us. Our priority is our neighborhood. If we don't have good relations with our neighbors in Asia, that's going to really impinge on our interests. So we have to prioritize the periphery. The Chinese call it Zhoubian. Then there's a school that says, no, it's not the major powers or our periphery. We are a developing country. We have always been a developing country. We are a third world nation. Chairman Mao came up with the idea of the third world. And our identity should be solidarity with other developing countries, and to try and promote the interests of developing countries in global affairs. And so China was instrumental in the formation of the BRICS grouping and a number of others, and is trying to become the advocate of developing countries in a variety of international institutions. Then there's the last two schools, briefly. So selective multilateralists and globalists are kind of siblings of one another. The globalists argue that global governance is really important, and that China is the world's second leading power and should be contributing to global governance proportionately with being the world's second leading power. Whole range of issues. China should be out there, very active, working with others multilaterally to address global challenges, whether it's anti-piracy, anti-terrorism, climate change, you name it, public health, But the selective multilateralists say, no, we can't do that. We don't have the resources to do that, and we don't really have the inclination to do that. But we should be doing some things, they say, yo soy Zole. So we should selectively involve ourselves in global governance and multilateral issues that are of direct importance to us, China, such as North Korea. So it's a kind of a la carte approach to multilateralism. Okay, so this is the spectrum of thought I found in Chinese discourse about their role in the world. So it's contentious. There is no conclusion. There are at least these 7 different kind of clusters. If there is one that I would argue is dominant, the realists, the major powers, Asia First and Global South, the 4 schools in the center, kind of collectively dominate Chinese diplomacy and this discourse. But amongst those, the realists are probably, in the last few years, the strongest. We can come back to that in the question-answer period if you're interested. Okay, then I start my chapters on different dimensions of China's global presence, beginning with diplomacy. Now, Chinese diplomacy has certainly gone global over the last 40 years. As I say, China's moved from really isolation to the periphery of the system, and now to the center of international diplomacy. It enjoys diplomatic relations with 175 countries, a member of more than 150 international organizations, and has signed on to more than 300 multilateral treaties. So China's in the system. The question is, what's it doing in the system? How is it behaving? So it's now a member. It's at the table, right? It has a role. But what kind of role? I have a discussion in this chapter about Chinese foreign policy decision-making, which is very complicated and also pluralized and rather confused. There are a number of forces that are fighting over Chinese foreign policy, not just these 7 schools of thought, but new actors such as Chinese multinational corporations. It's become a much more pluralized system. The central government, not to mention the foreign ministry, does not control Chinese foreign relations anyway. So if you look, though, at Chinese diplomacy, I argue that you find that the partial power thesis becomes apparent. On the one hand, China enjoys the trappings of being a major international actor. It's a member of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council of the United Nations. It's a participant in all the major summits, G20. Yet, on the other hand, I would argue, with the possible exception of its role in the 6-party talks with respect to North Korea, Chinese officials, I find, remain remarkably passive and reactive in international venues. They're not out there taking the lead, trying to forge consensus, trying to address any, I would argue, any international problem and challenge. They're very risk-averse, very conservative, very passive. They wait and watch what others do, other major powers, and then they kind of reveal their hand. And they're not, as I say, really influencing world affairs. which is, again, the measure of being a global power. Global powers, real powers, shape events and produce outcomes. And I find the Chinese diplomacy to be very low-key, as I say, kind of risk-averse and very narrowly self-interested. They only really care about China. Now, they meticulously negotiate international documents. They're very active in that regard, but usually just to strip out clauses that have been drafted by others that they disagree with philosophically, or to protect their own narrow national interests on issues like Taiwan, Tibet, and human rights. They're very active. And on those three subjects, boy, Chinese diplomats are really active. But other issues, no. Even, I would argue, with respect to North Korea in the six-party talks, where they have been now for, what, a decade, the supposed facilitator of the six-party talks to try and denuclearize North Korea. So where are we today? They have hardly, the Chinese, produced a positive outcome. Quite to the contrary. North Korea has grown its nuclear arsenal, is on the verge of yet one more nuclear test, could come any day. Just launched a ballistic missile last month that can now reach the west coast of the United States. So I would argue that under China's chairmanship of the six-party talks, the situation has grown far more threatening. North Korea has become more threatening, has more provocative behavior, precisely during the period when China was supposed to help work towards a resolution of these issues. In other words, I find China has indulged, aided, and abetted Pyongyang, has made the situation worse, not better. Why? Well, because of China's own very narrow national interests. They don't want an implosion on their border. It would have all kinds of very negative consequences for them. So once again, they're putting their interests above broader interests. That's not what real powers do, I would suggest. And when you look at a number of other recent international challenges and crises that we are familiar with, Sudan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, ongoing, Libya, Afghanistan, Somalia, I also find the Chinese have been remarkably aloof and generally unhelpful on those cases. In the case of Syria, they have contributed directly to the continued loss of life over the last year through their double vetoes with the Russians. So they're not only sitting passively by and watching the horrendous situation in Syria deteriorate, they have, again, I would argue, aided and abetted the Assad regime through the veto of UN consideration of humanitarian intervention or sanctions on the regime. So not exactly helpful in the Syria case, or I would argue, the other cases. So China is far from being what Robert Zoellick formerly called for. You probably know, in 2006, Zoellick gave a very famous speech in which he called on China to become a, quote, responsible international stakeholder. I would argue China is far from being a responsible international stakeholder. Two exceptions to that statement are its contributions to UN peacekeeping operations and its participation in anti-piracy naval operations in the Gulf of Aden off of Somalia, where in both of those cases, they're doing some good things. So there's a kind of curious incongruity in Chinese diplomacy, I find. It seems that Beijing is much more interested in protecting its own national interest than bringing along nations to a common position. And it places in its diplomacy more priority on form than substance. That is to say, the Chinese diplomats expend enormous time on protocol issues. You know, who's going to meet their president at the airport? Will they get a motorcade? Are they going to have a working lunch or a state dinner? Does their president stand to the right or the left of the other president? Will there be a communique issued? What should be in the communique issued? You know, I can tell you, or you talk to any diplomat in any country, including, I'm sure, the Czech Republic, when Shambaugh came here 2 years ago, I know there was a lot of protocol issues surrounding that They are obsessed with the appearance of China and China's leaders on the world stage. Why? Because it has a lot to do with the domestic legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. So they want their leaders out there to, be engaged in global statesmanship because it improves their image domestically. But, when they sit down at the table to discuss substantive issues, then the risk aversion tends to come out. I also find that China's diplomacy has a very kind of what I call transactional characteristic. That is, Chinese diplomats calculate what are they going to gain from any action or any investment. They think of diplomacy like commerce. Like they're going to invest in something. What's the return? Tangible return we're going to get out of it. Well, that's not the kind of mentality or philosophy a country should have in terms of public goods and contributing to global governance. So, in general, I find Chinese diplomacy, or I argue that it's quite passive. Now, you might say, well, that's what they want to be. And it could be that is exactly what they want to be. They are following Deng Xiaoping's admonition of 2 decades ago to Tao Guang Yang Hui, to bide our time and keep a low profile. They also, are not comfortable with what they call power politics, using influence. That's what big powers have done to them, and they don't want to do that to others. So I have to grant that that could be a conscious, this kind of risk aversion that I find could be a conscious decision. But whatever the source is, I find that Chinese diplomacy is not influencing international relations. And this becomes clear in the next chapter on global governance. You see this in spades. As I say, the whole concept of public goods is not something that China sort of philosophically understands, either domestically, I would argue, much less internationally. And they're very skeptical, and very sort of minimalist, and again, very transactional in their approach to global governance and public goods. These are a series of quotations from various Chinese scholars in the white paper, which, sort of express this skepticism. There's very deep skepticism about this concept. In fact, and much of the skepticism has to do with the United States. They think that this concept of being a responsible power is really kind of an American plot, an American trap to retard their growth. I had an official tell me, I interviewed him a couple of years ago, pretty senior official. He said, you Americans, first you try to retard our growth through internal political subversion back in the 1980s, and that wound up in Tiananmen. But here we still are, so you didn't succeed then. And then he said in the 1990s you tried to contain us in Asia. That failed too. We're stronger than ever in Asia. He said, now your latest tactic, you Americans, is to bleed us internationally. Get us involved out there on the planet in all kinds of what you call global governance issues that are not in our interests. So we're not going to fall for it, he said. So there's very deep skepticism in China about global governance. Having said that, though, I don't want to overstate the case, because China does contribute to various aspects of global governance. As I mentioned, UN peacekeeping operations and anti-piracy operations, counterterrorism, curbing greenhouse gases. They have a very assertive program, even though they are the largest contributor to global greenhouse gases. Overseas development assistance, non-proliferation, public health, and combating international crime. These are areas where China is involved, and very positively involved. And I have separate case studies in chapter 4 on these dimensions. But generally speaking, I find the kind of glass of water being half full, half empty. China's, it's probably better that it's half full. China is taking some steps, but I would argue not doing enough. Not doing enough proportionate to its size and importance in the world. Take contributions to the UN operating budget, for example. China is the world's second largest economy. It is only number 7 in terms of contributions to the UN operating budget. It's number 4 in contributions to the UN peacekeeping budget. There are other measures, but I don't see, so I find that China punches below its weight, we Americans would say. You can either punch at your weight, above your weight, or below your weight. I think they punch below their weight. They're not doing enough. We should expect more from China. So I completely agree with Robert Zoellick and his responsible stakeholder thesis. And China is a long way, or it's just not there yet. Okay, what about some other dimensions of China's going global? So, Ivana, we started at a little bit at 10 after, right?
I think we have still 5 minutes.
5? You said I could talk for 45. So, by my watch, I've still got 10 minutes left. Not going to compromise on that? Okay. I've still got to get through three more sections. So, if you look at three other dimensions of China's global presence, economic, cultural, and hard power, sort of economic, soft power, and hard power, what does one find? Economically, this is the one area, obviously, you would expect, and you do find, China to have global influence and presence, more than presence, influence. It's the world's second largest economy. It's had the highest annual growth rate in the world for more than 2 decades. It's the world's largest energy consumer, largest merchandise exporter, third largest trader in services, second largest trading nation overall, largest recipient of foreign direct investment, increasing exporter of foreign investment, has 4 of the world's top 10 banks in terms of capitalization, largest foreign exchange reserves, largest number of millionaires. You know how many millionaires there are in China now? 1,200,000. And the world's largest number of billionaires, 115 billionaires now in China. Wealthy country. And they're the largest holder of American government debt. So by these measures and others, this is a global economic power. But if you dig into it a little bit and scratch beneath the surface, you find that it's not as strong, or its position is not as strong as it might seem on the surface. Exports, for example, it is a global trading power, but its exports are still dominated by generally low-end consumer products. According to the WTO, 94% of China's exports are low-end manufactured goods, so almost 100%. Its financial services sector and its knowledge-intensive industries still lag considerably behind other East Asian nations, even behind South Korea, behind Japan, behind several Southeast Asian nations, and certainly behind the West European and the United States. Its global multinational corporations have, there aren't many of them, actually, and their global brand presence is relatively poor. How many Chinese brands can you think of? You know, what top to mind? Qingdao beer, maybe? Haier, you know, what would we call white goods, appliances? Lenovo, Huawei, Air China. Yeah, I mean, so you can maybe get to 10 internationally recognized brands, but at least according to there's sort of a list that Business Week and Interbrand put out every year of the top 100 brands. China doesn't have a single one in the top 100 internationally. What about its multinational corporations? There they do a little better. They have 61 companies in the current global Fortune 500 list, 61. But if you look at, that list is developed and defined by revenue. So these are the world's largest companies in terms of revenue. If you look at where the revenue, at these companies, and where the revenue is derived, only 2 or 3 of them derive more than 50% of their revenue outside of China. All the rest of them, 57 or so, are derived in China. So these are really domestic companies that have yet to go global. They would like to go global. Sorry. falling behind in my own slides. That's China's trade partners. Let me come to this. China's overseas investment, which is related to the multinational corporations, it's increasing. And as you know, here in Europe, it's increasing rather quickly. In fact, China's ODI into Europe is growing at a faster pace than anywhere else in the world, particularly over the last 2 years. So, but last year, well, I should say 2011, China had exported only $60 billion abroad. The figures for 2012 just appeared last week, and that was $77 billion. That still ranks China as 5th largest exporter of capital abroad. And then if you look at where that capital goes, you find that the top 4 recipients are essentially tax havens and pass-through places, you might say. British Virgin Islands, Grand Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and Hong Kong. And then you get to real countries like Australia. And guess where most of that money is going? Answer, mining, iron ore. And Sweden, the United States, Canada, Singapore, Russia. This chart's going to change a little bit given the increase in Europe and increased attention on Latin American and African markets. Okay, these are the top 10 global Fortune 500 companies. China ranks 3rd, actually just overtook Japan in 2012. So, you know, long way behind the United States, but still ahead of a number of others. What about culture? Let's turn to the last two areas, Chinese global cultural presence and Chinese security presence. Well, this is a huge topic, needless to say, but fascinating, and I really enjoyed digging into it. China is really, in a variety of aspects, broadening and promoting and investing in its overseas cultural presence. Its media presence, promotion of popular culture, fine and performing arts, film, literature, product brands, tourism, sports, music, science, and education. Confucius Institute and language teaching. You have a Confucius Institute here, Charles? No, not yet. You know, in a variety of ways, even animals, panda diplomacy. You know, the Chinese are really getting serious about global cultural expansion and presence, what they call 对外宣传工作 in Chinese. That means overseas propaganda work, literally, or overseas publicity work. Why? Because the government, well, here's Hu Jintao, has discovered that soft power is a part of being a global power. It's not just all about economy and military. They had, up until, I would argue, 2008, when he gave this address to the 17th Party Congress, China thought about being a global power largely in economic, scientific, and military terms. Well, they have a much more broad, comprehensive view of that now, and they use the term 综合国力 for to have comprehensive power. And so they're really fixated on their overseas image. And they have found that, rather distressingly, they have found that their overseas image is not very good. And this is a chart from the BBC annual polls on international image, favorable versus unfavorable, 2010 or 11. You see China right in the middle of the chart. So 44% have positive views of China, 38% do not. So it's mixed, you know. And whereas the Chinese would think to themselves they should be way up there at the top with Germany and UK and Canada, that the world should love us. But why doesn't the world love us? Then if you look at, they get even more distressed if you look at the trajectory over time of their international image. This is the Pew Global Attitudes Survey, American survey company, that shows trends over time. And China is the brown line in the center. And you can see that between 2005 and 2010, China's international image dropped 16%. It's pretty steady deterioration. You can break that out and look at different parts of the world. By the way, Europe has by far the most negative views of China of anywhere in the world, 70 to 80% across the 27, EU 27. Okay, so China has become, as a result, rather obsessed with soft power. What is it? Do we have it? Why? If we don't have it, why don't we have it? Where can we get it? Can we buy it? Is there a kind of Walmart of international relations? You can go down the soft power aisle and buy soft power. They wish it was so easy. Fortunately, soft power, they haven't quite come to understand this, in my view. It has to be earned, it can't be bought. They are putting a lot of effort into a number of institutions, what I call the messengers, to try and broaden their global cultural presence. It's all very, very assertive, and I'm sure you see it here in Prague. And it's being very well resourced, but I would argue that no matter how many resources, how much money you put into the messengers, if the message is not sellable, you're going to have a hard time. This is obviously the empty chair at Oslo of David Shambaugh, who was serving an 11-year prison sentence in the Liaoning province for subversion of state power, but received China's first Nobel Prize. They finally got one. In 2010. They got one last year with Mo Yan, the writer. So they now have 2 Nobel Prizes. But my point is that there are intrinsic weaknesses to Chinese soft power, one of which is political. So by Joseph Nye's definitions of soft power, China has a long way to go. For the sake of time, let me just argue that China's soft power is in fact very soft. Finally, hard power. What about China's hard power? Well, here you find, I would argue, the same thing. It's a partial power. On the one hand, the Chinese military has been on a really 20-year, very steady modernization program. China now has the world's second largest military budget, $170 billion last year. World's second largest navy, which is sailing literally further and further into the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean and other places. And it's fielded a lot of new weaponry. Armored personnel carriers, different types, tanks. These are photos I took at the National Day Parade, the 60th anniversary National Day Parade in Beijing on October 1st, 2009. I was fortunate enough to have a ringside seat in Tiananmen Square, and I snapped away, took a lot of photos. So they have short-range ballistic missiles, medium-range ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Their Navy, as I say, has made significant improvements. They have 78 destroyers and frigates. They've now got an aircraft carrier bought from the Ukraine and retrofitted. The Chinese military has made a lot of progress. I don't want to understate that. And in some areas, 3 areas in particular, they do have global power projection capacity. What are those 3 areas? Ballistic missiles, space, and cyber capabilities. Those 3 areas, they project power globally. But in other areas, air, naval, in particular, China is still an Asian regional power. And I would even argue that it does not yet have the capacity to really project and sustain military power more than 300 nautical miles from its coast. So it's not there even within its own neighborhood, but it's getting there. In addition to the military, China does other things in international security. I mentioned the peacekeeping component of that. That's important. China has about 1,900 peacekeepers abroad in 12 different countries right now. That ranks them number 1 amongst the UN Security Council members, but number 16 overall in the world. There are 15 countries, much smaller than them: Bangladesh, Pakistan, Denmark, others who contribute far more peacekeepers to the UN than do the Chinese. So that's another area where I think China punches way below its weight. Yes, we give them credit for the 1,900 they have out there, but they should have far more, I think. They are increasingly sending their military officers abroad for training, and they are increasingly training military officers largely from developing countries in their own military academies. They maintain defense dialogues and a very active set of military diplomacy exchanges with foreign countries all over the world, about 400 a year. And finally, they sell weapons abroad. They're now ranked number 4, according to SIPRI in Stockholm, in terms of global arms sales. And this chart, pie chart, shows you where most of those weapons are going. That's changing. They will probably move up the list, but they're still a long, long way, $5 billion a year. It's a long way behind the Americans, who I think last year sold 70 billion plus, or the Russians, who sell about 50 billion every year. So the Chinese are really sell, considerably less. That may change over time. And their weapons are of appeal to developing countries. They're cheap and relatively good for their capacities. So, where does this leave us overall? Well, I think China is a global actor, but I would argue that it's not yet a global power as defined by influence and by comprehensiveness. It is, as I say, in some areas, global trade patterns, global energy and commodity markets, using diplomatic leverage for certain issues, such as human rights, Tibet and Taiwan. Global tourism, they're dominating the global tourist industry. Global luxury goods, they have rescued Chinese consumers, have rescued the international luxury good market. Global art auctions, I have a whole section in the book about art auctions in Hong Kong and around the world. Wealthy Chinese are buying more than 50% of the art sold on auction last year globally. And some international sports, as we know. They finished second in the Summer Olympics, both the last 2 times. And, as I say, in the area of cyber hacking. Here they are a real superpower. So, in these areas, China is a global power. But as I argued tonight and do in the book, I don't really find in these other areas, the 5 areas I've gone through, that China is yet a global power. It's on its way. Glass of water, proverbial glass of water is half full, half empty. Maybe 10 years from now, they will be punching at their weight or above their weight diplomatically. Maybe the so-called string of pearls strategy will materialize in their military posture. Maybe they will gain soft power and global cultural influence that they seek. I'm more dubious about that myself. So it's going to change, but right now, I would argue, China remains a partial power. So, Ivana, sorry, we've gone a little bit over, but I'd be happy to try and answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, David, for your fascinating and very complex presentation. Yeah. I believe that Prague is the first European city where you present your book, so we'll be prepared for a lot of comments in the question and answer session. You touched upon many issues: culture, FDI, military, China's perception of world's perception of China, so many that I will not go to summarize them. I just have one comment which you might probably react to. I find myself real skeptical about this equation: power doesn't equal influence. Maybe that's more on the question of Joseph Nye, but since he is not here and you are, I will ask you. If you define influence as the ability to shape the world's outcomes, shape the events, I find China really good at doing that. China is blocking the negotiations with the DPRK. China is blocking sanctions to Iran and so on. If the influence is the outcome or ability to shape the outcomes of international affairs, maybe it's not only what you can do, but also what you can prevent to do others.
Well, you're right, and in those areas, China is exerting negative influence. But that's a type of influence. It's not a positive influence. It's not trying to get to resolution, at least the way that other members of the international community are trying to get to resolution of those issues. So I suppose you're right, but it's in size, influence is a hard thing to analyze. One way is the classic way is what Nye and others say, is to get another party to do what they would otherwise not do. That's the classic definition. So embedded in, but Nye then will say there are two ways you can get another party to do what they would otherwise not do. One is coercively, the other is co-optively. That's the soft power concept. So I don't really see the Chinese getting others to do things. That's the way I'm approaching the question of influence. But they're clearly blocking in those two cases you just mentioned, but Syria as well. Sudan, actually, one has to be fair. They changed their position 3 years ago and are more part of the solution than part of the problem in Sudan. Although I would remind you that Bashir is indicted by the International Court of Justice, I guess the only country in the world that he visits, China. They won't turn him over to the ICJ. So, they're just not yet, but they'll use their influence on things that matter to them. As I say, Taiwan, Tibet, human rights. Those are the three things. And they will penalize Japan, or they'll penalize other, they're trying to intimidate Southeast Asian countries, particularly the Philippines, over their maritime territorial disputes. They're using economic leverage, withholding trade in certain goods with the Philippines and Malaysia, but towards Japan as well. So this is negative influence, right? I guess they've learned how to play the sanctions game a little bit. But to me, that's not exercising, positive. It's not a real power, in my view. They're not out there in the world positively trying to shape and bring others along. Powers try to organize others, around a common goal. They don't seem to be doing that. They're just interested in themselves. I find them to be a very selfish power.
Well, thank you. Let's give a chance to the audience. We'll take 2 to 3 questions. Please identify yourself before asking a question.
Well, I just would follow up this discussion. Apparently your understanding of power is something positive, something creative, and it's you cannot think about power without responsibility. When talking to the Chinese officials, now I don't mean about, I am not interested in official proclamations, but in personal discussions. Can they conceptualize power in this way, whether they want China to be involved or not? Do they think about power in this positive way?
Excellent. Oh, okay.
2 more.
Okay, sure.
To save some. Sure.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So far, I believe that the book will be very promising. I would like to ask you, could you please tell us more about, regarding domestic discussion about Chinese role in global governance. Have you managed to contact Chinese policymakers, or did you interview Chinese scholars predominantly? Have you involved ordinary Chinese citizens? I wonder.
Also, a gentleman back, there was a question.
Good evening. Jan Hornath, student at the Department of American Studies at Charles University. I have a question. In recent years, we have seen quite a few Chinese political analysts and scholars discussing democracy within China. Now, their conception of democracy is a little bit different from the Western liberal democracy.
Right.
And I believe it was Yu Ping who had a very famous essay now called "Democracy is a Good Thing." And I wonder how far is the Chinese Communist Party willing to go in tolerating this kind of a inner discussion of democracy, and how far is it willing to go in, let's say, pursuing these suggestions of their scholars? Do you think they have some kind of an influence on the Communist Party? Thank you.
Shall I respond to those three? Okay. Well, maybe I can respond in reverse order. Well, the third one's a good question, and I've got a great book for you to read on the subject. My last book before this one, called China's Communist Party, Atrophy and Adaptation. That's what that book is all about. And I'm pleased to say that that book has actually been translated and published in China last year with the help of Yu Ping himself. And he's somebody I admire a great deal and know as a colleague and a friend. And their publishing house at the Central Committee Translation Bureau actually published this book in Chinese. And one of the sort of miraculous things, they published it 100% accurate translation, which is really astounding, given the sensitivity of the subject and the things I talk about in the book. But people like you, well, first off, I would say there's not a lot, in my view, I may have a different view from you on this, but I don't find a very active democracy discourse in China. And it's suppressed quickly when it happens. There are, sort of some creative thinkers on the subject. Yu Ping, certainly one of them. But the rest of them have a sort of democracy with Chinese characteristics discourse. They talk about consultative democracy. They have different varieties of democracy that they say fit the Chinese conditions, none of which are democracy as we would understand it. None of it involves direct elections to a parliament, for example, not necessarily for a presidency. You just had your first direct election for president in this country last week. Congratulations. But the Chinese wouldn't, Chinese scholars don't talk about direct elections at the national level. They don't talk about separation of powers. They don't talk about independence of civil society or media or other sort of criteria that we would just take as basic in democratic systems. So they have some interesting creative thinking going on in various institutions, Central Party School and others, but it's still within real tight bounds of discourse, in my view. And it's going to be interesting to see if under Xi Jinping there is some relaxation and loosening of this. That's one of the key things I'm looking for, and a number of other analysts, is whether, because we know there's tremendous frustration amongst intellectuals, and in the party as well. I've talked to a number of party intellectuals and even officials, who know they need to loosen up the system, but so far that has not happened. In fact, I would argue that since 2009 there has been a considerable tightening and retrogression, have gone backwards on political reform since 2009. There are various reasons for that, and we can get into that. That's a kind of different subject than this book. But it's going to be interesting to see if the new government begins to relax and go back to a more reformist path. We have seen over the last 30 years a repetitive cyclical pattern, what the Chinese call fan and show. Show to close, fan to open. So we've been in a show phase since 2006, I would say, really 2007. And the question is whether they'll return to fan. I just read, before coming over here this evening, one of Xi Jinping's speeches that he gave in Guangdong when he went down there last month has been leaked through the Hong Kong media. Intentionally, unintentionally, I don't know. But it's all about the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's a very tough speech about how we the Chinese Communist Party cannot go down the path of political reform in a variety of areas, because if we do, we'll wind up like the Soviet Union. And this is the main part of that other book of mine that I just mentioned. They have studied the Soviet experience, and probably the Czechoslovakian experience, and the GDR, and other former communist states. They have exhaustively studied this experience, how it happened, so civil society, velvet revolutions, things that brought democracy to your country. They don't want to go down this path because they think it will inevitably cascade out of control. And they may be right. So this is what Xi Jinping's leaked speech, I just read this afternoon, indicates. So I would not, if that's true, then that's unfortunate, because I was hoping that Xi Jinping would be a bit more creative about this subject. Okay, second, your question, I interviewed over 100 officials and scholars for this book in China, and outside of China, actually, too. And I read a lot of their writings, so there's this kind of strong empirical, and I interviewed diplomats in the United Nations and in Geneva, in a number of the UN organizations in Switzerland. So I talked to them about how they perceive China's activities in global governance. So it's not just seen only through the Chinese eyes, it's also seen through the eyes of other foreign diplomats. But there's a pretty good empirical basis for that chapter. And that was an interesting chapter to do. I hadn't worked in that area previously, so I'm quite interested in it now. And your question about, do the Chinese think about power in the ways that I have tonight? Not really. There's a lot of debate about power, but they don't, except for the realists. The realists think of it, in my realist school amongst the seven, they think of it in these terms about leverage, how to produce outcomes. But as I say, they are China firsters, how to use leverage to advance national goals. That's not global governance. That's not international responsibility. So they don't really, the globalists, my other school at the right-hand end of the spectrum, they're the only ones who understand the concept of global responsibility and public goods and contributing for the sake of broader benefit, community benefit, global international community benefit. Otherwise, there's not much recognition at all in China about that responsibility comes with being a global power. They haven't philosophically, in my view, gotten there yet. Maybe they will over time, but I don't know. Having studied China as long as I have, I think the China firsters are going to be the dominant school of thought for some time to come.
Let's take more questions. I see a lady in the back, and another lady in the back, and a gentleman here.
In the back room, actually. I hope you've been able to hear back there. Apologies.
Thank you very much for your presentation of your book and researching. I found it's very interesting information for me because at the moment I am also writing about the relation between China and EU. So my question is, as you say that China is going global, and in the future, do you think EU can manage its relation with China in order to ensure the win-win situation?
In order to ensure what?
The win-win situation.
Win-win.
Yeah. And my second question is very simple. How and where can I get your book?
Amazon.com or Oxford University Press, but you can get it more cheaply on Amazon.
There was a lady before another lady?
Yes.
Yeah, that's one.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering, since China is a very big consumer of energy, what can we expect, what kind of position can we expect of China in the future on the commodity market, especially like if you consider that energy is a very important aspect in relative power in realist theory. Well, I think that's all. Thank you.
Well, let me just make sure I understand your question. What can we expect from China on international energy markets?
Yes, exactly. What
commodities markets? Okay.
Commodity and also energy market. What kind of position? What weight will it have on the energy market?
Good question.
Yeah.
And the last question was from the gentleman here in the middle. Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. I would like to ask you about military expenditures, because today Chinese military expenditures are 1/6 in comparison to Americans. And I would like to ask you, what is your opinion about these trends in the sense of economic growth? Thank you.
Okay, that's percentage. Okay, let's see. The first young lady in the back, I assume by your question about win-win that you come from China, because that is a phrase, no? From Vietnam, okay. But it's a phrase that Chinese diplomats always use. We want to have win-win outcomes, mutual benefit. And that's fine. That's what diplomacy and relations between peoples and countries should be about. So it's good rhetoric, but I find that it's somewhat at variance with the practice of Chinese diplomacy, which is much more national interest oriented. Chinese commerce is more win-win. So I think it may vary by domain that you look at, but if you look at the economic domain, you may find more of a mutual approach than one finds in the diplomatic or the global governance area. But you're more directly, you're interested in how I see the evolution of China-EU relations. And it's a subject that I've been interested in for more than 20 years. I've worked on. I don't follow it as closely these days as I once did. I've written a couple books on the subject, actually, so I'm not as up to date on it now as I once was. But I'm of the view that China-EU relations did very well from the end of the Cold War until 2007. That's what you might call the honeymoon phase of the relationship. In 2007 to 2011, the marriage phase began. And the relationship began to deteriorate rather significantly over those 4 years. There are a variety of reasons for that. Several reasons. One had to do with the publication by the European Commission of a new China strategy paper that they call Communication. You should go back and read the communication of 2007. All the previous communications were very positive in their language and orientation. The 2007 paper is very critical of China on a whole number of indicators, a whole number of areas. And that was critical because there were a lot of criticism across the EU, in many different societies, including here in the Czech Republic, about China. Human rights, trade, behavior, growing trade deficit, the Dalai Lama, immigration, crime issues, global governance issues, environment issues, all kinds of things. So in fact, the 2007 European Commission paper was a better reflection of EU thinking about China than the previous papers. But the Chinese did not take the paper very well, shall we say. There were also changes in the national governments in Europe at the time, and the greatest advocates for China, Jacques Chirac and Gerhard Schroeder and Tony Blair, Blair's predecessor? John Major, yeah, left office, and their successors, including Blair, were not as sort of pro-China as as their predecessors were. And there were other reasons for the deterioration of the relationship between 2007 and 2011. So it went through a 4-year bad patch, as the British would say. In 2011, both sides took steps to try and stabilize it because both sides were very concerned about this deterioration. And I would say that they're still, here we are 2 years later, or a year and a half later, and they are more stable, but they're distrustful. They're not very deep, I would say. China-EU relations are predominantly commercial, first of all. There is no strategic dimension to China-EU relations. And in many definitions of that term, because the EU has no strategic presence in Asia, unlike the United States. The commercial side of it is changing. China's I would say the cultural side of it is changing. China's cultural exchanges with the EU are dramatically increasing in a number of areas. What impact that's having on EU perceptions of China is going to be interesting to see. There was, in fact, a slight uptick in EU perceptions of China in 2011. That was not on the slide that I showed. The slide I showed ended in 2010, but there was a slight improvement last year in European perceptions of China. Whether that can be sustained, you'll have to see. And then the commercial side of it. China's overseas direct investment into the EU is growing dramatically, but it's not. There's sort of a mixed picture, is my impression, of how it's viewed. Some countries it's viewed positively, and other places it's viewed very suspiciously. So I wouldn't say it's win-win. I would say you're European and I'm not, so it's not for an American to tell you about China-EU relations, but my perspective from the other side of the Atlantic is that they've stabilized. But it's a marriage, you know, that the rose has gone off of the relationship, and both sides are kind of viewing each other with a little bit of suspicion. And lastly, you know, 27 countries. The Chinese get frustrated, just the way the Americans do, by 27 countries. Doesn't act with coherence. It's much easier for countries like the Americans and China to deal with a coherent entity than a fractured entity. So. You know, that's just a reality, though. And so the Chinese have problems with that. Therefore, they concentrate on Germany, and Germany, and Germany, and Britain a little bit. They don't have a broader, they don't have a broader kind of strategy, I would say, for the rest of the continent. That's a very good question, though, and we'll have to watch it. Commodity markets impact, very large. This is one area where China is a global power, no doubt about it. I come from Chicago, where the Global Commodities Exchange is located. They affect the prices of iron ore and a number of other commodities on an almost daily basis. Iron ore prices really spiked after 2009 globally because the Chinese were hoarding iron ore, building up a strategic supply of iron ore. And then they stopped in 2012, and the prices began to go back down and stabilize. But you can look at a number of other minerals and metals and things sold in the traded on the commodities exchange. You'll find the same thing. China is having a really significant impact on prices, and is now the world's largest energy consumer. Oil, all kinds of things. So that is an area where I definitely would say China is a global power. And finally, Chinese military expenditure. Yes, it's the world's second largest number, $107 billion last year. In March, we will find out what the new figure is. It's been growing by 14.5% per year for 30 years. This is a very significant increase, steady increase. And in an inflation-free environment, it has even greater impact. And China has generally not had inflation during this period of time. There's also extra budgetary funding. The official figure is not representative of all of the expenditure on the Chinese military. But China is not unusual. Many countries, including the United States, hide military expenditure in other budgets. And the Chinese have been doing that for a long time. But the good news, if you will, is that they now practice something called zero-based budgeting, ZBB, that Zhu Rongji instituted when he was the premier. Under zero-based budgeting, it means you cannot roll over unspent funds into the next fiscal year. You have to return it to the central. Any money you don't spend has to go back to the coffers of the Ministry of Finance. Well, that means you want to spend your money, right? Well, it's reduced corruption, for one thing, in the military. So what I'm trying to say is that the official budget today is much closer to the accurate number than it ever has been before. I myself, there are different estimates, but I would estimate it's about 10%, 15% at most. There is 10 or 15% more money spent on the military than the $107 billion that was last year's figure. But your question was what as a percentage of economic growth. Okay, well if you look at it that way, it's not what people would call a large defense burden. China spends 1.3% of GDP on defense, I believe 1.4%. Spends 8.5% of its total state expenditure on defense. The pie, so the piece of the pie is not that large. And the pie, of course, is growing. China's economic pie is continually growing, so therefore the slice also grows. And the military is getting more and more. But this is not a crash. This is not an investment that is distorting the rest of the economy. And I would argue this is another lesson learned from the former Soviet Union, which did distort their economy through excessive expenditure on military. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union spent as much as 55% of GDP on defense. Around half, or a little bit more than half. The Americans today, we spend 7.5%, I believe, of GDP on defense. So the Chinese have learned that they don't want to distort their overall economic progress through over-expenditure on defense. Nonetheless, there's a lot of money going into the military, and I would just argue that most of it's going into what I call software, not into hardware. Yes, they have new weapon systems, such as I showed you on the screen, but most of the money is being invested in personnel, salaries, logistics, what's called C4ISR, Command Communications Intelligence, that kind of stuff. And they realize that you can't have a modern military without having a professional military. So they're putting money into capabilities of humans and technology before putting it into lethal weapons. But nonetheless, you know, they are investing into hardware as well. It's probably a longer answer than you wanted to your question.
Signaled by the people from the American Center that we actually have much more time than I thought. We don't have to wait. We don't have to finish at 6:30. We can actually stay here as long as you would like. Because David is not exhausted. So let's take another round of questions.
Hello, I'm Rolf Thurs from the Institute of International Relations. Nice to see you. We met last time. Welcome to Prague again.
Nice to see you.
I enjoy your book. It seems very refreshing. My question is, did you receive any interesting feedback from the Chinese scholars who live in the USA?
Good question, Rudolph, but the book hasn't been out long enough to have gotten feedback yet. I'm going to be very interested to see what the Chinese scholars, and for that matter, the Chinese government think of this book, and whether they will decide to translate it and publish it in China. It's going to be an interesting kind of measure. On the one hand, I anticipate that the Chinese government will be in agreement with the basic argument, because they've been telling the world for years, we're weak, we're a developing country, don't worry about us, our rise is overblown in the West. You know, we're not threatening, we're not out to dominate anybody else, we're benign, we're really weak, we're way behind you Americans. Well, they will love this book on those criteria, right? But on the other hand, they're going to have, I might hurt the feelings of 1.4 billion people, as they say, you know, because they think of themselves as a major power, and they want to be a major power. And so I think the kind of argument about being a partial power and the kind of implicit criticisms I make in the book, which I've made here this evening, about global governance, for example, responsibility, being a global citizen, not being narrowly self-interested, and so on. I think that's going to be the part that where the Chinese are going to probably disagree, and we'll see. No, I'm not the first person to criticize the Chinese. Many of these other books I mentioned at the beginning are highly critical. You should read Aaron Friedberg's book if you want criticism. But it's going to be interesting to see how they take this. It only came out last week in the United States, so it hasn't gotten to China yet.
Hedvika Kudiusková, Department of International Relations and European Studies, Masaryk University. Well, I have a question. If you look at the internal Chinese power grid, it surprisingly is usually described as quite complicated with many, overlapping authorities, which might, have some influence to the foreign policy decisions, complicate the process, or even slow it down. So my question is, how do you look at this? How can the, internal structure in China influence the foreign diplomacy?
Should we respond to that? Well, I have a discussion in chapter 3, I think it is, about the Chinese foreign policy making process. And I did a lot of interviews with Chinese officials and foreign policy makers. And they are the first to admit that the process is anything but smooth and centralized. They will tell you that they in the foreign ministry, for example, are very frustrated because there's so many actors and so many voices in the government and outside the government in society that are kind of pulling at foreign policy. And the 7 schools that I put up there are kind of indicative of that. So the day when this kind of smoothly functioning communist system of decision-making existed is over. I think the Chinese foreign policy process is in need of great institutional revision. I'm not the only one. They need to overhaul the system. There's, for example, very little communication between the civilian and the military side. That's one problem. They don't have a centralized, high-level body to coordinate policy across various ministries in the government. And now, because foreign relations involve all these areas I've been talking about tonight, it's not just diplomacy. It's what their companies are doing abroad, what they're in the education sphere, the Confucius Institutes, their overseas aid. You have all these the China Development Bank and several other banks, very active on their own in different countries. So there's all these actors that make for really rather diverse, pluralized process. But what they don't have is kind of central, what Americans have in the National Security Council, for example, in the White House. That's what they need. They need a National Security Council style system. And they've kind of flirted with that idea for several years. But so far they haven't established it. Coordination is a real problem for their foreign policy, I would argue, an increasing problem.
Are there more questions from the audience?
Hello. You mentioned that within China there's some concern that greater global engagement could kind of bleed away resources that they need for domestic affairs. How much legitimacy do you think there is to that concern? And if there is some, do you think that the U.S. Could benefit from less kind of global engagement similarly?
No, what I was saying was that Chinese, who I interviewed on this question of global engagement and global governance, argued, at least, several of them, including the official that I quoted, argued that involvement in global governance would bleed their resources. But I've had several officials tell me that, and we just don't have the resources. And our bureaucracy is not set up for it. And these expectations that you Westerners have of us, some of them say they're inappropriate, some of them say they've come too early. They recognize that the responsible stakeholder concept is valid, some officials do, but they argue that China's rise has happened so quickly that they're not either philosophically or bureaucratically ready to assume that kind of global responsibility. Take, for example, their aid programs. You know, most countries' aid programs are run out of foreign ministries. They're ministered by the foreign ministry. China's is run out of the Ministry of Commerce. That tells you a lot about how they think about aid, right? Aid is a kind of investment into commercial enterprises. And if you look at their aid programs, you know, there's a lot, well, there are a number of aspects that do not conform to global standards of the OECD, Development Assistance Committee, of the World Bank, and other international donors. So they've got a long way to go. That's another example, I would argue, where in global governance, they're doing good things. I want to give China credit, in fact, on the aid front. In public health and agriculture and education, particularly in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia, doing really important good work. So it's not a entirely critical story, but a lot of the aid, which is only $2.5 billion a year, that's another thing. You know, they are not even in the top 10 donor nations in the world in total amounts. So they've got a ways to go. But if you look at where the aid goes, it's predominantly Africa, and it's into hard infrastructure predominantly in countries that have raw materials that they want to export out of there. So they'll be happy to go to a country and build a stadium, build a palace, build a road, build a rail line with their own workers. They export their own labor to the country, not employing local staff, local workers. And they'll build whatever the project is, and they'll go home. And then their diplomats and their business people arrive and knock on the door and say, okay, now you've got a beautiful new rail line, sometimes from a mine to a harbor on the coast, incidentally. Or you have a new stadium or something. And it's great, the country has a new stadium and a new rail line, but the quid pro quo is exacted in raw material extraction in many of these countries. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's kind of half and half. So anyway, I think they've got a ways to go in that regard.
Professor, my name is Shane Siegel. I'm a political officer here at the U.S. Embassy. As the Chinese economy grows, as the labor force demands higher salaries, and as the companies that previously went to China because of cheap labor move to places like Vietnam and Bangladesh, will the Chinese economy have the wherewithal to make up for the low-end manufacturing that it paradoxically likely will lose as the economy grows?
That's a great question. You're right that that labor costs and operating costs in China have been rising quite dramatically in the last 10 years for foreign companies. It's not as cheap to operate, or inexpensive to operate in China as it once was. In fact, China's Beijing now has the highest corporate office-based rents in the world today. It costs a lot of money to maintain multinational staff in China today. And wages have gone up and should go up in China. So all of this has made it less cost effective for major multinationals to operate, and their profit margins as a result in China have begun to narrow. This is to say nothing of the impediments to investing in China. Intellectual property right theft at the top of the list. Forced technology transfer, environmental concerns. There are a lot of problems that have been there for a long time for foreign companies, but now if they were willing to tolerate the problems because the cost of operation was not very expensive. Now the cost of operation is more expensive. So what are they doing? American companies and most European companies and Southeast Asian and Japanese, I can tell you, are now adopting what they call China Plus strategy. They're not moving out of China to Vietnam. They are simply broadening their footprint. They're reducing their footprint in China, and then establishing production bases in Indonesia, Vietnam, Mexico, and India. So it's a kind of recalibration of their exposure. That seems to be what most of the major multinationals are doing. Is that going to change the nature of the Chinese economy? I don't think that itself will. What needs to happen is, and the Chinese government is very open about this, they need to rebalance their economy, have a real macro change in the growth model. From the growth model of the last 30 years, which has had two main elements. One, export-driven growth in low-end manufactured goods, largely produced by inbound foreign investment, right, on the eastern seaboard. That's been one element of the growth model. The other is intensive investment, domestic investment, into hard infrastructure, roads, rails, high-speed rail, harbors, buildings, all kinds of things. That growth model is widely recognized, has now run its course. The World Bank has told them that in the 2030 report this last year. So what needs to happen, the World Bank and the Chinese government, the State Council, Premier Wen Jiabao is very open about it, is that we have to leave that growth model and adopt two new elements. One is services. One is domestic consumption-driven growth. We have all this pent-up cash. China has the world's highest household savings rate, 52%. A lot of money, corporate money, pent up, which is looking to go out, right? That's another story we can talk about, is these Chinese companies are investing abroad. What are they going into and how are they doing it? M&As and so on. But they want to unleash domestic consumption plus invest in innovation, create a knowledge-based, innovative economy and move up the value chain so as to change the composition of exports. They're not going to abandon exports, they want to change the composition of exports. So this is a long answer to your good question. But so far, despite the rhetoric and the recognition, there's no evidence of this shift in the growth model. It's very difficult to do. It's what political scientists call path dependency. Once you move down a path, you become dependent on the path, particularly when the path employs a lot of unskilled or semi-skilled workers, as is the case in China. And when there's a lot of corruption involved in the path. And there's enormous corruption in the current Chinese economic system. And thirdly, state-owned enterprises. So, to change the growth model breaks a lot of rice bowls, and it's not easy to do this, even though they need to do it. Otherwise, if they don't do it, though, they're going to be stuck. Mind you, a lot of countries would like to be stuck where the Chinese are. Not calling the Chinese economy a failure by any stretch of the imagination, but they're going to be stuck at the lower end of the value chain. They're not going to be able to do what Japan did, South Korea did, Taiwan did, Singapore has done, a number of other newly industrialized countries. So this is a kind of, pretty crucial transition period for the Chinese economy.
If there are no more questions, I would like to thank once again to the organizer, the Association for International Affairs, for organizing the event, also the U.S. Embassy for kindly co-sponsoring Professor Shambaugh's stay in Prague, and the American Center for hosting us today. And of course to you for coming to Prague. It's an extreme pleasure to have you here, and we hope to see you much often.
Thank you. Enjoyed being here. Thank you very much. Mario.